Britain is facing a project of ethnic cleansing where indigenous British people that have ruled these islands for thousands of years will be moved out in favour of a new population from Pakistan and the Islamic world that will render Britain effectively a colony of Pakistan and indeed of other countries. Now, this is a radical view and something that most of us are uncomfortable talking about. But actually, this video isn't about news and it isn't actually about the opinions of me. I want to tell you a little story and then see whether you want to watch the video after that. I guarantee you will. I've got a friend of mine whose ambition it was to always live in the United Kingdom, who now no longer thinks that's a very good idea. And I'll tell you the reason. He is ethnically part Belarusian and part Ukrainian, but was born in Moldova. Now, in this part of the world, there is a significant level of ethnic cleansing and it's been going on for thousands of years. As an example, Vladimir Putin always said that the reason that he invaded Ukraine was because of the treatment by the Ukrainian army of ethnic Russians in places like Crimea. And of course, when the Russians invaded, they ethnically cleansed ethnic Ukrainians out the way. We all know about the Holocaust, fairly obviously one of the worst examples of ethnic cleansing of them all. And of course, in 1943, 1 in 4 people from Belarus was murdered over 2 or 3 months by the German army. We've also seen the invasion of Poland and all of these sorts of things. So, in Eastern Europe, they know probably better than anywhere else how to ethnically cleanse, whether that be the Balkans or indeed the place I've talked about. But critically, they do it in 2 ways. They obviously have these mass genocides, but obviously what they also do is the low level moving people on and changing the nature of the population. My friend, who is not a public or political figure, genuinely believes that's what's happening in Britain. And when he first saw this country, he recognised a lot of the things that happened in Eastern Europe. More on that in a moment. And he believed that Rishi Sunak was the person responsible. The reason he thought that is because he simply assumed if you have an Indian Prime Minister and there's ethnic cleansing going on, the 2 things must be linked. Obviously, he later realised they weren't. His take on it was remarkable. When he looked at the King's speech a year or 2 ago, he watched the choir at the end and said the following. That choir was picked because it had the minimum number of white children. Wow. I've never really thought of it like that. But in fact, he has a whole take on the way that Britain is being run, which suggests very heavily that Britain is discriminating against its own indigenous population. Now, what I asked him to do then was this. Make a list of the things that happen in Eastern Europe that discriminate against people in order to ethnically cleanse them. And let's just take a look at whether we recognise that in Britain. Oh my God. The list that I'm going to go through with you today will leave you absolutely stunned. Now, just to explain, my mate genuinely believes that whilst there is ethnic cleansing going on, he believes that we're doing it to ourselves and effectively our society is self-aborting. Also what he believes, and you know, I'm not necessarily endorsing this, what he says is that we are wrong when we believe in a multicultural society. What will happen is one culture will win, one culture will lose. This whole idea of everyone rubbing along side by side is not right. What will actually happen is that your culture will be replaced by somebody else's, and actually you've got to stand up for your own tribe. And so English for the English, and Belarus for the Belarusians, and Pakistan for the Pakistanis. Anything that you do beyond that will not work. And all of these left-wing lawyers who believe that we can be in a situation whereby everybody is equal, everybody is the same, and everybody has a right to live in Burnley, that will not result in Britain being enriched. It will simply result in a takeover. And experience in history has taught us it's always better to discover than be discovered. Of course, we live in a world where people complain about colonialism whilst in creating enclaves of Pakistanis in the UK. Okay, so this video goes through the list of how to ethnically cleanse in Eastern Europe and invites you to ask yourself whether you recognise any of the things on the list. I will give you little bits of help here and there. But before I do that, I just want to say one of the ways that we're fighting back against the ethnic cleansing of British people is the Patriot Fund. We give money to small projects and we help people out who are trying to get messages out in their community and defend our cause. You can donate on PayPal. The link is below. Please do help us and I'll give you the monthly update which is sent to everybody. Okay, let me go through the headlines of the way that you ethnically cleanse in Eastern Europe. They are property, violence and coercion, population, siege mentality, culture and symbolic destruction, media, psychological and social tactics, jobs, justice, and paramilitary force. So let's start, first of all, with population. What you do, first of all, to ethnically cleanse people, it's the most important bit of them all, is that you start moving in a new population by incentivizing either immigration or migration. So you start to create that enclave of new people moving into the area. You can't do anything unless you start with that. So you need things like the Afghan resettlement scheme or uncontrolled immigration in order to do it. But you've also got to incentivize it with things like free healthcare and indeed access to jobs and access to housing, because obviously people have got to want to come to an area which is quite alien to them and populate it. And obviously that takes a certain amount of gumption to do it. And so you need to persuade people. So point number one is on population. And what you have to do is start getting a new population to come in the thousands and millions. And you do that by opening your borders and indeed encouraging people. Then what you do is you encourage a high birth rate amongst the new population with policies like allowing multiple marriages, with policies like social security, and you discourage a high birth rate from the existing population with things like, in this country, abortion, which obviously many migrants won't do, but British people will. And slowly but surely what you start to do is tip the balance, and the area starts to look more and more like the country that people have come from. Obviously, there's elements of infrastructure as well, and we'll come on to that in a moment. But the first and most important thing is get them here and get them having children. Point number one. Point number two, violence and coercion. A lack of police action on violence against the existing population. So that is to say that if you walk down the street and people punch you for being a white guy, nobody does anything about it in the police. You absolutely suppress ethnic violence against this group, and you don't take any police action on it. That means that things start to feel hostile. You recognize the new population coming in, and the new population is allowed to hurt you and get away with it. Rape and sexual violence. It is vital that the new group are encouraged to use rape and sexual violence against the existing population. First of all, to break their spirit, but secondly, to encourage more anchor babies. So more and more of the population is sort of brought in. This is why Yazidi women were taken into rape gangs. It's why actually in the Islamic world, rape gangs are quite common. But what you do is, first of all, you destroy the spirit and the will of the families by raping their daughters. But then what you do is you ensure that those daughters themselves have babies and now have mixed emotions. Whilst they've been raped by this community, they also now bear the babies of that community as well. So that is absolutely vital. Then those community leaders that complain about it, you lock up in prison. And we have seen people, we have seen that happen. It has to be said. It's not on a wide scale, but certainly people who've complained about rape and sexual violence and no-go areas have been locked up. Next point on property. Housing priority will now go to the new population. And we've seen that in Britain, haven't we, where whilst you're not officially whilst you're officially not entitled to a council house anymore by being a new migrant, what you are entitled to a council house is if you are somebody who's got no family in the area and are homeless, which is more likely to be a migrant family. So in fact, property does favour new arrivals. Then you have to remove the old population from property and move new people in. Now actually, in Britain, that's kind of the same thing, because it's council houses that were previously given to British families, now going to ethnic minority families that have arrived more recently. So that means that the housing stock now slowly but surely starts to go as a priority. And what you do, by the way, is you let the ordinary people go out on the streets in favour of housing the new arrivals. Hence why you make sure that soldiers, veterans are not given accommodation, but asylum seekers are. Then this is interesting on property. Didn't think about this. The regular looting of shops to ensure that they're not viable, to destroy local businesses. That is the shoplifting epidemic. Do not prosecute shoplifting because it makes the shops of the British population not viable. And once the housing is discriminating, once lots of people move to your area and your daughter's been raped and your house has been taken off you and your shops have started to close down in favour of other shops that are not being looted, that is, of course, starting just to ratchet up that pressure and effect. Siege mentality. Okay, make sure access to public services like doctor's appointments becomes increasingly difficult. That is because you can't actually go about your everyday life anymore without it becoming tiresome and difficult. You know, you can't drive down the street without it being 20 miles an hour, or you get a fine for doing all sorts of things which are crazy. But fundamentally, your ability to actually access services is hard. Now, remember what we've done now. We've brought in a new population. We've discriminated against housing and etc. There's violence. And now actually to access the services you need is becoming very hard. That's encouraging you to leave so that you'll be obviously in a place where those public services are easier to access. Okay. So the next point, surround the remaining enclaves of the existing population with no-go areas. That's kind of related to the sexual violence that was before, which of course, once again, now it's quite hard because, to get to my local shop now, I have to walk through this area. But if I walk through this area, I'll get punched and the police won't do anything. Okay, so next, God, this is a bad one because it's happening in London. Change the names of critical infrastructure to reflect the new population. The Windrush line and all of these new railway lines, which are named after, instead of British history, they're named after the values and the interests of the new population. So suddenly, your local sign in a Southall railway station is now in Urdu or Punjabi or whatever, just so it shows you that no longer you are in charge and just reminding you constantly. Now, let's go to cultural and symbolic destruction. Burn down the religious institutions of the existing population or make sure they close because they're no longer viable. The burning down has happened of churches, I accept not to a large extent in the United Kingdom, but certainly the closure of churches and the removal of that infrastructure has become a thing. Pull down the statues of historical figures so your history and your heritage is no longer visible. You can see the new religious institutions of the new population. You can see names of streets being changed and institutions being changed, and your statues are being pulled down just to say, boom, not welcome. Remove history books. God, it is crazy, this list. Remove history books from academic institutions and replace them with the history of the new population. Start teaching in schools that your history is terrible and the history of the people that have arrived is great. Wow, unbelievable. Psychological and social tactics. This is actually about media propaganda, and also he explained about things like allowing multilingualism and whatever, and kind of discriminating against the language itself. Not as relevant to the United Kingdom, it has to be said. Jobs. Oh my God. Positive discrimination in jobs, favouring the new population over the old population. Point number 2, ensure the government is dominated by the new population, so all of those plum jobs in local government now go to the new people instead of the old people, and we make sure that we're protecting that group. So it just feels like the area is starting to change. And employment law based on ethnicity rather than competence. And I think we've seen that, where there are quotas for Asian and black people, but there are no quotas for white people. And so that discrimination happens all the time. I will tell you, when I used to be a contributor at the BBC, they used to phone me all the time and say, Andre, we'd love somebody who's like you, but have you got anyone black? But otherwise we won't hire you. 300 quid job, you're not going to get it because of the colour of your skin. So that's the issue in terms of jobs. Justice, two-tier justice, and a domination of the police and the courts. That is to say, the police's job now is to ensure that the new population feels protected, whilst the old population gets a separate justice system, which is far more draconian, far more bullying, and far more likely to result in criminal prosecution. And of course, that two-tier justice system, I think we've seen in Britain. Ensure the government, constant surveillance and harassment by the police. So instead of the police worrying about dealing with the fact that you're being beaten up on the streets, instead they're spying on you and knocking on your door to complain about all the things that you said. Not necessarily locking you up or prosecuting you, but just harassing you and needling you to make you feel extremely uncomfortable and extremely nervous. Criminal law that makes everyday life illegal. Oh my God. What that is hate speech. It's saying that if you want to have a legitimate political debate in the way that you always had a political debate, that is now illegal. If you want to insult the Islamic faith, that is now illegal. Normal stuff that is part of your everyday life is illegal. A young kid who accidentally drops a Quran, crime. Mentioning on Twitter you're anti-immigration, crime. Saying by, what's her name, Lucy Conley, that she doesn't care if somebody burns down a migrant hotel, crime, crime, crime. Your everyday life is now illegal. And that makes it incredibly difficult for you to function. And paramilitary force, that is to allow the formations of de facto militias to bully the local population. Now, they don't have to be formalised, but these are marauding gangs, potentially selling drugs to the existing population and beating them up. Also, ensure that those groups can guarantee that no-go areas are created to make the whole place feel extremely hostile. And finally, the paramilitary groups will run the campaigns of rape and indeed the other unpleasant bits that the police themselves can't carry out, but the police themselves will turn a blind eye to all of it. Now, I don't care what you think about my political views, and I don't really worry too much about yours. We have a right to debate and be open and free. But if you listen to that list and you say, I do not recognise the United Kingdom from that list, I think you are stark raving mad. Now, there are other things that I didn't list. There are things like genocides. There are things like burning down, all sorts of things that don't happen in Britain, and thank God for that. But if you were to say, is Britain A, supporting ordinary British people, or B, mounting a low-level campaign of ethnic cleansing, you would have to go with option B, wouldn't you? And I can now understand why somebody who's an ethnic Belarusian or an ethnic Ukrainian is extremely worried. Because what happened in places like Ukraine, what happened in places like Belarus, what happened in places like Poland, and indeed to the Jewish population, was that this is how it started, and it just got worse and worse and worse. I personally do not believe that things are going to get worse for British people, and I don't believe that this is a conspiracy. But you know something that somebody said to me the other day? The reason that Jewish people are all so negative is because the positive ones stuck around and died in the Holocaust. Is it possible that this is just the start of a more brutal process of ethnic cleansing? Certainly. In history, that has happened before. Religious wars have led to huge numbers of people being killed and injured. And indeed, the idea of us turning Britain from a socially homogeneous country into a Balkan-style country is something that inevitably has already led to the torture of young girls by rape gangs and, of course, by the discrimination against us in things like jobs and housing. Is this just a rant by a grumpy far-right extremist? Well, maybe. Maybe I am wrong. But ultimately, I haven't presented you today my opinions. I've simply read a list of things given to me by somebody who will now not live in Britain on the grounds he's white. Because he says that it is very clear that Britain is ticking the boxes of a country that may well mount a genocide against white people. And that is something that he is concerned about. It is partly a function of his upbringing that he's concerned about it. And it's a function of my upbringing that I'm not as concerned about it. But I think all of us need to think about this. And the final thing I'd say to you is this. Assuming that everybody is actually a well-meaning person, what has actually happened here is this. We have attempted to see ourselves as citizens of the world and to assume that everybody from every culture, every creed, every country is exactly the same and could integrate into Britain if they came here. By doing that and by trying to be welcoming to people and by forgetting that we have to look after our own people as the Bible tells us to do, by not doing that, even though what we're trying to do is be nice, we're actually heaping out a big piece of discrimination to our own people. When we turn around and say, well, you know, it's vital that in the King's speech, black children and Asian children are represented, we are at the same time saying that white children who've done absolutely nothing wrong should not be represented because of the colour of their skin. I think that that is the problem that we're in, and we end up in the situation with Courtney Wright, don't we? Where, you know, I can kind of understand what the teachers were going for. They were trying to be welcoming to a new population coming into the area, but it didn't cross their mind that some people cared about the existing population. But that's what's happening time and time again. Anyway, this video is made in order to support the Patriot Fund. Please do donate. We really need your money. It really does help. And I can send you the monthly update so you know that the money is being effective. We've supported things like the Women's Safety Campaign. We've supported giving cameras to people to film more of their experience. And also we're hoping to launch training for ordinary members of the public who want to speak out about their community. We do training already for people like the Free Speech Union, but that's kind of a little bit separate. Okay, thank you so much for watching this video. Until next time, arrivederci and goodbye.